The moment her helmet hissed open, the entire room froze. Commander Ethan Drake had faced alien fleets in interstellar wars, but nothing prepared him for Princess Lyra Vexus. Her gaze locked onto his, and for the first time in years, he forgot his rank, his mission, everything. What happens when the fate of two civilizations hinges on a single electrifying glance? The polished metal of Lyra's helmet reflected the artificial lights of the Odyssey's docking bay, fracturing beams into prism-like streaks across the walls. Her fingers moved with deliberate precision as they found the seal beneath the curve of her headpiece. Every human in the chamber tensed. Rifle stocks pressed into shoulders, breath caught in throats, all waiting for aggression or deception. Commander Drake flexed his hands open at his sides, the only visible sign of restraint from a man trained to react to sudden movements. The helmet didn't clatter to the floor as expected. It lifted smoothly, revealing inch by silver-cast inch what no earthling had ever witnessed firsthand. Bioluminescence bloomed across her features like constellations emerging at twilight. Patterns mapped her skin in intricate traceries that pulsed faintly, responding to the room's electric silence. Human pupils dilated involuntarily, optical nerves unprepared for the play of iridescence shadowing her jawline, her temples. The protestations of xenobiologists back on Earth, warnings about uncanny valleys and evolutionary disgust responses, vanished under the weight of something far more primal. A Marine's grip slackened around his pulse rifle with an audible creak of gloves. Nearby, the ship's linguist exhaled a syllable that wasn't quite a word. Every protocol for first contact had accounted for hostility, for negotiation leverage, for emergency quarantine procedures. None covered the arresting realization that beauty could weaponize wonder. Drake's training manuals never mentioned the physiological symptoms either. His sternum ached beneath his regulation jacket, a sensation unrelated to combat scars. The indifference he'd maintained during 3 hours of diplomatic blustering dissolved into an unsettling clarity. Her pupils weren't round but elongated, fracturing ambient light into spectral bands as they tracked his face. The markings weren't static. When she tilted her chin slightly, the delicate lines beneath her eyes flared cobalt, then softened into indigo. Some deep-buried human instinct recognized the cadence. An autonomic response, yes, but one mirroring the rhythm of terrestrial waves breaking against shorelines. Familiar, yet irreducibly alien. A quiet gasp rippled through the assembled officers. Drake registered the sound through the rushing in his ears, not fear, but the abrupt silencing of it. He knew with bone-deep certainty that no classified threat assessment back at Fleet Command mentioned this phenomenon. Perhaps they'd encountered it before, expunged records of ambassadors who'd faltered at the sight. Perhaps that was why so few first-contact veterans remained on active duty. She spoke first. Not in the guttural consonants the xenolinguistics teams had predicted, nor the ultrasonic chirps picked up by deep space probes. Her voice carried the timbre of wind through reed beds if reeds grew in zero gravity. The translation earpieces worn by the diplomatic team emitted a startled chime, not from error, but from detecting a syntax more poetic than logistical. The panic buttons beneath the negotiating table went untouched. Across from Drake, Admiral Singh's fingers uncurled from where they'd hovered near the emergency beacon. Singh had commanded ships through Kessler syndrome debris fields and plasma storms, yet now sat motionless, caught mid-breath like a cadet on his first orbital drop. Drake's pulse should have steadied when the initial shock faded. It did the opposite. His body responded as though approaching a singularity. Not the event horizon of danger, but the irresistible pull of something that rewrote known laws. He'd once stood atop Olympus Mons at dawn, watching his shadow stretch across Martian regolith until it seemed to touch the curvature of the planet itself. This felt like that. Vertigo with infinite dimensions. The Helmholtz resonators embedded in the Odyssey's walls picked up the shift, and subsonic hum matching the frequency of Lyra's bioluminescent fluctuations. Later, the ship's chief engineer would spend weeks attempting to replicate the phenomenon before admitting it defied human-made acoustics. One of the junior tacticians surreptitiously deactivated the retinal scanners built into his contact lenses. The device had been programmed to catalog alien physiology for threat assessment. Every alert it generated, unusual pupil dilation, estimated musculature density discrepancies, now felt grotesque. He'd spent 6 months training for covert data extraction and abandoned the mission in 9 seconds. Objective reality reasserted itself in increments. The sterility of the docking bay's air filtration system, the metallic tang of adrenaline at the back of throats, the way Lyra's first footstep echoed, not awkward in Earth's gravity as predicted, but weightless as a diver pushing off from the seafloor. Drake became aware of his own breathing. Too measured, a conscious correction for the erratic rhythm his ribs wanted. He'd negotiated with mutinous colonist factions and unshakable corporate warlords, but his vocal cords refused to shape the prepared statement about mutual interests and territorial boundaries. The Zarathian delegation showed no surprise at their princess's effect. Their own gazes held something beyond pride, the quiet confidence of those who'd long since surrendered to awe. A silver-skinned attendant rotated his three-fingered hand in a gesture the Odyssey's cultural database had flagged as ambiguous. Reassessment suggested it mirrored the movement of binary stars orbiting one another. Science officers would later debate whether the markings responded to emotional states or ambient energy fluctuations. Drake didn't care about the neurology. When Lyra took a step toward him and the patterns brightened just slightly, his skin prickled as though brushed by an ionized current. Someone coughed. The sound should have shattered the trance. Instead, it underscored the realization that lifted the hairs on every arm in that room. Something fundamental had just changed, not in the carefully scripted treaties waiting for signatures, but in the buried assumptions wired into human hindbrains. The kind of shift evolution notices millennia later. The history text would chronicle the months of negotiations that followed, the painstaking accords signed under flickering holographic projections. But none would capture this, the breath before the first word, the moment the future hinged not on weapon yields or resource claims, but on an ache behind the sternum that lacked a name in any Earth tongue. Lyra's first words carried no demands for territory or resources. They bypassed every tactical assumption hardwired into Earth's negotiation playbooks. Instead, her opening remark floated across the conference table like a ripple in still water. Our bodies remember the same stars. The translation earpieces buzzed for 3 entire seconds before settling on a syntax the human delegates could parse. Military attachés exchanged glances over datapads still displaying planned arguments about mineral rights and demilitarized zones. The princess didn't speak again immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch, watching as Commander Drake's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the subtle lean of someone recognizing a melody heard long ago. Admiral Singh tapped the tabletop twice, signaling the science team to verify whether the statement contained coded meaning. Their instruments detected nothing tactical, only an acoustic resonance matching certain harmonic frequencies found in Earth's magnetosphere. Lyra extended her hands, palms upward. The bioluminescent tracery along her wrists intensified, forming patterns reminiscent of cosmological diagrams. One of the junior xenobiologists later confessed in his report that he'd instinctively reached for his own wrist, as if expecting to find matching markings beneath his uniform sleeve. The princess spoke again, her voice modulating in a way that made the translator units flicker between languages before settling on an approximation. Your bones hold calcium forged in supernovae. So do ours. Across the table, General Arena suppressed a scoff. His fingernails dug into the prepared statement about trade route security. With respect, he interjected, we came to discuss navigation protocols, not poetry. Drake didn't turn his head, but his jaw tightened. He'd heard that tone before, during debriefings where soldiers dismissed civilian casualties as collateral damage. Lyra's responding smile contained no condescension. The markings around her eyes softened into hues resembling Earth's twilight horizon. Starlight remembers no boundaries, she said. It crosses parsecs to reach both our worlds. A data crystal embedded in her forearm accessory projected holographic equations above the table, not warfare schematics, but mathematical representations of shared elemental abundances between their species. The numbers glowed amber and cerulean between delegations. Drake's hand drifted toward his left ribs. Beneath his uniform lay a scar from a border skirmish 19 years prior, back when Earth's nations still fought over patches of irradiated tundra. The medic who stitched him up had been a conscripted poet. While suturing the wound, the man muttered verses about how human skin couldn't actually contain the constellations they inhaled with every breath. 3 fingers swept downward in a motion resembling featherfall, then paused at chest level. Lyra mirrored it be. The alarms hit first, a triple frequency shriek that bypassed cognitive processing and went straight into spinal reflex. Commander Drake's hands were already moving toward tactical displays before his conscious mind registered the damage reports streaming across every screen. Hull integrity warnings flashed crimson in 6 different sections. Impact tremors rolled through the Odyssey's frame like seismic waves. Drake grabbed the nearest console edge as a console exploded nearby, sending a shower of sparks across the navigation array. The attack made no tactical sense, no demand for surrender, no hail from aggressors. Just 3 precise strikes against their engines and life support systems. Across the war room, Admiral Singh bellowed orders into his headset. "Report, who's firing?" A junior officer shook her head mutely, fingers flying across a sensor panel that showed nothing but empty space around their coordinates. Drake pivoted toward the observation window. The starfield looked undisturbed, just pinpricks of light against black. Then he saw it. A ripple in space itself, a distortion like heat haze over desert asphalt, there and gone within a heartbeat. Another impact slammed into them a second later, rupturing the portside cargo bay. Lyra moved before Drake could call to her. Her fingertips brushed the Zarathian communicator embedded near her collarbone. The bioluminescent markings along her neck pulsed rapid fire, red, then violet, then a red so deep it resembled old blood. Around the room, human crew members reacted to the sudden flare of alien light with weapons drawn, before reason caught up with reflexes. 2 decks below, the Odyssey's weapons officer swore as targeting systems refused to lock. Whatever was hitting them reflected no radar signature, emitted no detectable energy trail. The projectiles seemed to materialize from vacuum itself. Lyra reached Drake in 3 long strides. The usual grace of her movements had sharpened into something predatory. "Cloaking field," she said, the translation unit clipping her words into something jagged but clear. Her fingers sketched a shape in the air between them. Humans would later learn it was the Zarathian glyph for phantom. The ship lurched again. Containment fields flickered around damaged sections, buying them minutes before explosive decompression. Drake grabbed the nearest comm channel. "All hands prepare for..." An impact sheared through the sentence. The floor tilted 15 degrees starboard with a groan of stressed metal. Drake's knee connected painfully with a console edge as he caught Lyra's elbow to steady them both. Somewhere in the chaos, a voice crackled over the comms. "They've hit the Zarethos too." Lyra's pupils contracted to slivers. Drake hadn't known they could do that. Beneath their boots, the artificial gravity fluctuated, leaving stomachs hovering near throats before resettling. The lights dimmed to emergency blue, casting everyone's faces in underwater tones. Across the room, Admiral Singh locked eyes with Drake in silent mutual understanding. Whoever was attacking didn't care whose ship they hit. Lyra's communicator emitted a 3-tone chime. She touched it once, then spoke rapid Zarathian to Drake's translator earpiece. "Your helm responses are too slow." The accusation held no malice, only urgency. Drake's hands were already pulling up the tactical display between them. "We can't fight what we can't see." Lyra's fingers danced across the console, entering commands at a speed human engineers would later analyze frame by frame. The display reconfigured into an unfamiliar waveform analysis. "Watch the light," she said, and pointed at a section of the star chart where nothing visible existed. Drake stared. For 3 long seconds he saw only black. Then there, a faint scattering of stars seemed to blink out for a millisecond, as though something vast passed before them. His targeting officer sucked in a breath. "That's not a ship signature. That's phase distortion," Lyra finished. Her markings flared with each word. The Zarethos hailed them. The projected image of Captain Vell rippled with interference, but his command came through clear. "They're bracketing us both. We'll draw fire in 5 seconds, be ready." Drake didn't ask for clarification. He yanked the comm to engineering. "Divert all non-essential power to starboard thrusters. Full burn on my mark." Lyra touched 2 fingers to Drake's wrist where it rested near the controls, a Zarathian gesture meaning synchronicity. The markings along her forearm pulsed once, intensely, before she turned to relay orders to her own crew through the communicator. When the attack came, it hammered the Zarethos first. The alien cruiser took 3 direct hits along its ventral side. Instead of evading, Vell held position, a perfect stationary target for their attackers. Drake's tactical officer made a choked noise as the display showed the Zerithos deliberately exposing its underbelly to fire. "Mark," Drake ordered. The Odyssey pivoted like a diver, arcing sideways in midair. The starboard thrusters flared to full burn, pushing them beneath the path of subsequent torpedo volleys that had been meant to pin them against the Zerithos. Someone on the bridge swore when the ship performed a maneuver classified as structurally inadvisable in all training manuals. Lyra gripped the navigation console as the inertial dampeners struggled to compensate. "Again," she said. "They'll adjust aim in 3, 2... The phase distortion shimmer reappeared, 4 points this time. Drake's weapons officer fired blind, ordnance spiraling into empty space. All 4 torpedoes missed. Lyra made a sound like air hissing between teeth. She input a new sequence into the Odyssey's guidance system, too fast for Drake to follow. The ship banked sharply, rolling 80 degrees portside even as she spoke rapid Zerathian to her own vessel. The Zerithos responded not with weapons fire, but by emitting a pulse of energy in a frequency scanners initially catalogued as useless. The distortion shivered visibly, like pond water disturbed by a thrown stone. "Now," Lyra said. Drake's torpedoes streaked toward the rippling space. This time 2 connected, not with a ship's hull but with something unseen. Space itself seemed to tear open for half a second, revealing the sleek angular lines of an unfamiliar vessel before the cloak reasserted itself. The explosion came 3 seconds later, a gout of flame with oddly contorted edges, due to the phase-shifting interference pattern. 2 of the remaining attackers peeled away with abrupt course corrections, breaking their formation. The 3rd fired anyway. Drake saw the torpedo lock before the alert sounded. No time to evade. It would impact midships, rupturing their primary oxygen recyclers. The proximity alert hadn't finished cycling when the Zerithos slid into view, like an ancient city rising from mist. It took the hit across its dorsal shields, flaring violet before the energy dissipated in arcing tendrils across its surface. Little things stuck with Drake later. The way the console vibrated beneath his fingertips during those split-second decisions. The scent of overheated wiring and human sweat. How Lyra's markings had stabilized to a constant amber glow once their maneuvers synchronized, as though reflecting confirmation. When the last distorted shimmer vanished from sensors, silence fell across the bridge. Slowly, crew members straightened from defensive postures. The Zerithos hailed again. Captain Vell's image flickered this time with actual damage to his own vessel, but his bearing remained upright. 2 retreated. 3rd didn't escape clean. "We're tracking residual phase variants," Lyra answered in their language, then turned to Drake. The bioluminescent patterns along her temple had dimmed to near invisibility, except when she moved. They weren't aiming to kill, only to disrupt. Drake checked the casualty reports scrolling along his monitor. Minor injuries, no fatalities. A strike pattern this precise didn't happen by accident. You knew their tactics. Lyra's nostrils flared, a human gesture she'd picked up, though hers carried different meaning. "We've seen their work before." She touched the communicator again, this time with a finger tracing downward. Drake would later learn it signified morning. Admiral Singh approached them cautiously, datapad abandoned at his station. "Fleet Command needs—" "The cloak failed under combined sensor input," Drake interrupted, still analyzing the attack sequence on his screen. Human scanners detected mass anomalies but couldn't resolve them. Zerathian systems read phase distortions but lacked baseline references. Lyra nodded when he glanced at her. "Separate, we're blind." The words landed heavier than the torpedo impacts. Around them, crew members exchanged glances, some uneasy, others calculating. The silence stretched until the damage control officer cleared his throat to request repair priorities. Drake turned to the main display where the last images of their attackers still hovered. Grainy, indistinct but undeniably artificial. Not Zerathian, not human. Something with technology capable of hiding in plain sight between 2 wary civilizations. Lyra stepped closer to study the images. Her shoulder brushed Drake's arm. Whether by accident or deliberate contact remained unclear. When she spoke, the translator rendered her words quiet but precise. "They won't stop just because we saw them once." The observation deck's transparent dome framed swirling nebulae in continuous motion, colors shifting at a pace too gradual for human eyes to notice minute by minute. Drake stood near the reinforced glass, watching stellar nurseries churn in distances that made fleet deployments seem insignificant. He didn't turn when the door hissed open, though his shoulders tensed just slightly, a commander's reflex when hearing unexpected movement in supposedly secure areas. Lyra's footsteps made less sound than they should have, even accounting for her lighter mass. Zorathian physiology distributed weight differently across the foot structure. "You're not sleeping again." She didn't phrase it as a question. The diagnostic scanner embedded in the door arch had logged his 37 prior visits this cycle, all during hours marked for crew rest. Drake exhaled through his nose, watching the faint fog of his breath disappear almost instantly in the deck's climate-controlled air. The Odyssey's environmental systems kept humidity at 43% for optimal human respiration and Earth-normal acoustics. They hadn't adjusted for Zorathian preferences yet. "Admirals don't sleep," he said. "We hover in low-power mode." The joke tasted stale halfway out. 3 weeks since their ships had fought off the unknown attackers. 2 weeks since they'd proven combined sensor arrays could detect phase-shifted cloaking technology. 1 week since the first joint mission briefing, where someone had actually laughed at a cultural misunderstanding instead of reaching for sidearms. Lyra moved to stand beside him near the viewport. She didn't crowd his space, but also didn't respect the unspoken 2-foot radius most officers maintained around him. The faint bioluminescence along her jawline pulsed softly in the dimness. Patterns Drake had learned indicated contemplation rather than alertness. A diagnostic panel across the room flickered, its power flow momentarily disrupted by some surge in the ship's grid. The light caught the silver threads woven through Lyra's sleeve where repairs hadn't quite matched the original fabric after their battle. "They want me to formally relocate negotiations to Earth next month," Drake said into the quiet between them. Full diplomatic entourage. Press coverage. Somewhere beneath them, Deck 14 still bore carbon scoring from torpedo impacts. The ship's architects hadn't prioritized cosmetic repairs over functional ones. Lyra tilted her head. It wasn't quite a nod. "Our council debates sending my youngest sister instead. More photogenic, less military history." The markings along her temple darkened briefly at the mention. Drake had seen enough of her people's body language now to recognize that particular shift as something between resignation and displeasure. Outside, a distant star flared momentarily, some cosmic event whose light had traveled years to reach their vantage point. Drake wondered whether either of their civilizations had existed when that burst of energy first began its journey. The insignificance should have been comforting. Somehow it just made everything feel heavier. "What terrifies you most about peace?" Lyra asked. Not casually. Zorathians rarely did anything casually, he'd learned. Their equivalent of small talk involved debating which stellar formations best represented societal structures. Drake flexed his left hand absently, feeling the old scar tissue pull. "Logistics. Half my fleet can't tell a trade agreement from a surrender clause." It was the expected answer. The safe one. Commanders worried about practicalities. They filed reports about resource allocation and diplomatic incident protocols. Lyra made a sound deep in her throat. Not disagreement, but acknowledgement of evasion. The glass before them reflected her silhouette faintly, a shimmering outline overlapping nebula clouds. "You humans," she murmured. "So careful with your words, so reckless with your weapons." A silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. Drake found himself studying the reflection more than the actual starfield. Noticing how the nebula's hues brought out undertones in Lyra's skin, that artificial lighting flattened. His training had included xenobiology modules, muscle density variances, respiratory system comparisons, tactical assessments of joint flexibility in combat scenarios. None of those charts captured how the faint glow along her collarbone dimmed and brightened in time with her breathing. He looked away first. "It's the quiet," he admitted. "After years at battle stations, standing down feels like—" His fingers twitched toward his sidearm out of habit before forcing them still. Like missing a step in the dark. Lyra removed her right glove. The motion looked ritualistic, precise folds of the material, each crease pressed deliberately between her fingers before she set it aside on the observation deck's railing. Beneath her skin bore thin, silvery scars arranged in patterns Drake recognized immediately. Shrapnel, close-range energy weapon discharge. A particularly distinctive keloid ridge along the outer wrist matched the kind left by failed shield generator overloads. She turned her hand palm up, letting him see the marks clearly. When the civil wars ended on Zarath, my battalion celebrated for 3 days straight, loud enough to shake the mountains. The bioluminescent tracery between her fingers shifted from its usual gold to something colder, steel blue tinged with violet at the edges. On the 4th morning, I woke convinced something was wrong because no plasma fire shattered the quiet. Drake found his own palm upturned before consciously deciding to move. His scars were less elegant, jagged thing from when regenerative gels hadn't set properly, patches of grafted skin that never quite matched. They stood out against his complexion in ways Lyra's silvery seams blended into hers. She didn't touch him, just let their hands hover centimeters apart, close enough for body heat to register. Your medics recorded something curious after the battle, she said. Our ships exchanged personnel to assist with wounded, yes? Drake nodded. They'd lost 7 crew members that day, 4 humans, 3 Zarathians. The latter's bodies had been returned in sealed pods per customs neither side quite understood yet. When humans treat Zarathian injuries, Lyra continued, recovery rates improved 19% over our own medics' projections. Same for your personnel under our care. The blue in her markings intensified momentarily. Your scientists think it's biochemical, some compound in our respective physiologies responding to cross-species contact. Outside, something vast and dark drifted between them and the nebula, one of the Odyssey's escort vessels moving to its assigned position. The temporary dimming made Lyra's bioluminescence more pronounced. Patterns Drake had never noticed before resolved along her forearm, delicate branching lines like celestial maps or neuronal pathways. Even at rest, they pulsed faintly, swirling slowly as though stirred by invisible currents. My brother was among those lost in the second bombardment of Feral Canyon, she said. The markings flared sharply cobalt for exactly 3 seconds before settling back toward gold. I stood watch for 7 hours waiting to hear if his wreckage had been recovered. Command protocols required me to remain at strategic headquarters. No personal exceptions, even for the High House. Drake didn't offer condolences. He'd sat too many death vigils himself to pretend words helped. Instead, he watched how the nebula's light caught in Lyra's eyes, how Zarathian irises split incoming illumination into spectral layers human vision couldn't perceive unaided. Against the starfield, her pupils weren't simple black voids, but depths containing hints of color shifting with each blink. A proximity alert chimed softly somewhere behind them, routine course correction for the Odyssey's orbital path. The deck plating vibrated faintly underfoot as maneuvering thrusters fired. For the duration of that small tremor, Drake felt the lightest press of fingertips against his palm. He couldn't tell if Lyra had moved or if the ship's motion had bridged that last gap between them. Later, reviewing security footage, engineers would note an anomalous power fluctuation, coinciding exactly with that touch. Nothing serious. A 0.3% variance in Deck 12's environmental controls lasting precisely 4.2 seconds before stabilizing. The ship's AI logged it as insignificant. Drake's breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with atmospheric adjustments. The warmth of Lyra's skin felt nothing like he'd expected. Not the dry heat of human flesh, but something almost electrical. Not painful, but present in ways normal touch wasn't. His pulse jumped under her fingertips and the blue in her markings deepened in response. She didn't pull away. Your scientists are wrong, I think, she murmured, about why our wounded heal better together. The deck's artificial gravity chose that moment to fluctuate just slightly. Not enough to send anyone stumbling, but sufficient to make loose objects shift. A stylus rolled off a nearby console. Drake's boots scraped against the floor as his balance compensated. Lyra didn't seem affected at all, or perhaps she simply compensated differently. When their lips met, the taste wasn't what either species' xenobiologist had anticipated, not metallic, not overtly alien. Salt and something indefinable, like ozone after lightning strikes or deep earth minerals uncovered by spring floods. The contact lasted 2.8 seconds before Drake drew back, though neither could have measured that span consciously, long enough for his fingers to tighten around hers. Not so long that either needed to acknowledge what diplomatic repercussions might follow. Lyra's markings had stabilized into a hue tactical reports didn't have names for, somewhere between sapphire and liquid silver. The nebula beyond the viewport framed her in shifting color, its slow celestial rotation too ancient to care about fleeting mortal moments. Her fingers remained laced through his when the blade glinted oddly under the ceremonial lights, not silver nor gold, but something between. Ethan held it flat across both palms, feeling the weight of its history in every gram. Steel from the Odyssey's wrecked thruster housing. Iridium scavenged from the Zerithos' shattered hull plating. 6 weeks in the flagship's experimental forge, watched over by smiths from both fleets who'd argued about thermal, thresholds, and molecular bonds, until the metal itself settled the debate. Lyra's attendants had dressed her in what passed for Zerethian court regalia, layered fabrics cascading down one shoulder, leaving the other bare to display the bioluminescent markings tracing her collarbone. Eyes fixed on the weapon in Ethan's hands, she went perfectly still. Around them, the assembled delegates from both governments inhaled sharply as one. Ethan didn't kneel. Human custom suggested it, but Zerathian protocols required blood oaths be exchanged standing, weapons held between partners to symbolize shared sacrifice. The blade's edge caught the light in irregular patterns. Its alloy shouldn't have existed, the kind of substance materials scientists only theorized about. 16 failed attempts had preceded this one, each shattering under stress tests or corroding when exposed to opposing atmospheres. Lyra's senior advisor made a sound like rattling pebbles deep in his throat. "Princess, consider the precedent," she laughed. The crystalline tone silenced further protests mid-syllable. Ethan felt more than saw the reaction spread through the chamber. Human delegates blinked at the unfamiliar sound. Zerathians typically expressed amusement through rapid bioluminescent patterns rather than vocalizations. Older Zerathian courtiers pressed their palms to their sternums in what the human cultural attachés had listed as a mixed gesture of shock and approval. "Show me the edge," Lyra said, extending both hands without breaking eye contact. The blade balanced strangely, not properly weighted for combat despite its lethal appearance. It felt alive in a way metal shouldn't, responding to proximity by giving off micrometer-thin tendrils of what ship's sensors swore was ionized vapor. Ethan turned it slowly, letting the flat catch the artificial sunlight streaming through the domed ceiling. Scars marred the surface in places, microscopic excavations where the forging process had nearly failed. Lyra's fingers hovered above the steel, not quite touching. Her bioluminescence pulsed in configurations no one in the chamber had seen before. Not the rapid-fire sequence of alertness, nor the slow bloom of contentment, but something deeper. Like watching magma flow beneath thin crust. "I had to cut 5 centimeters off the lower tang to make the weight distribute properly," Ethan said. The admission shouldn't have felt intimate standing there with 200 dignitaries watching, but it did. Lyra's nostrils flared, a gesture that meant something different for her species than his. When she finally touched the blade, her fingertips left faint smears of cobalt luminescence along its length. The markings swirled into the metal's microscopic imperfections rather than evaporating as expected. Her advisor shifted uneasily. "Let me see your hands," she said. Ethan turned his palms upward. Years of calluses and scars mapped his history. Plasma burns from an engine room accident at 17. The neat surgical slice along his lifeline from a boarding skirmish near Tauceti. Lyra traced nothing of that. Instead, she found the nearly invisible scar from 3 weeks prior, the one smiths from both species had given him when testing whether human blood would activate the alloy's dormant properties. The wound had healed too cleanly, puzzling medics from both fleets. Around them, the chamber's gravity fluctuated barely perceptibly, a programmed adjustment for the ceremony's next phase. Objects drifted minutely toward the ceiling before settling again. The sensation made several humans clutch at armrests. Zerathians seemed unaffected, their inner ear structures compensating differently. Lyra ran her thumb along the forgotten scar. As the last traces of artificial gravity dissolved, she pressed the blade's edge to her own palm in a single fluid motion. Gasps echoed. Blood welled, not red, but the silvery mercury shade unique to her species. Where droplets broke free, they spiraled lazily through the weightless environment instead of falling. Ethan didn't hesitate when she offered him the blade. The cut stung less than he anticipated, his own blood forming slow crimson spheres that hovered between them. Their mingled droplets collided not randomly, but with eerie purpose. silver wrapped around gold, forming helical patterns that made the nearest science officers lurch forward before remembering protocol forbade interruption, one particularly. Bold Lieutenant fumbled for a scanner, data. Would later show the blood cells arranging themselves according to no known biological imperative. Lyra pressed her palm to Ethan's. There, combined blood formed a single, suspended shape, part double helix, part nebula, part something no existing language had words for. Someone whispered a Zarathian phrase the translators couldn't parse. Too old? From a dialect lost to standard education centuries ago. The oldest human delegate responded with what sounded like Latin, though few in attendance recognized it. The blood shape held its configuration for precisely 12 seconds before dissipating into hundreds of microscopic globules that drifted toward the chamber walls. By the time gravity reasserted itself half a minute later, the drops had vanished, absorbed into porous ceremonial tiles designed to preserve such moments. Later analysis would show the alloy in those tiles underwent permanent molecular change where the droplets touched. Lyra kept her palm against Ethan's for 3 full minutes after gravity returned, far longer than ceremonial necessity dictated. The warmth between their skin felt different this time, not the nerve-jangling near electricity of their first contact, but something steadier. Like finding an orbit after drifting. Somewhere in the chamber's upper tiers, a junior diplomat started clapping. Others followed with increasing certainty until the sound filled the dome. Humans striking palms together, Zarathians clicking the specialized bones in their wrist to produce rhythmic vibrations. Both species equivalent of approval, overlapping at last in shared tempo. The blade rested on the pedestal between them, already cool to the touch despite having conducted something neither fleet's engineers could satisfactorily explain. Its strange metal caught the artificial sunlight. Differently now, refracting light into patterns that occasionally resolved into shapes resembling both species' written characters before dissolving again. Lyra's senior advisor stepped forward with the ceremonial casing, required by tradition, a Zarathian heirloom box lined with what looked like velvet but behaved more like liquid under certain conditions. He hesitated when reaching for the blade, clearly uncertain whether touching it without permission might provoke some unforeseen reaction from the volatile alloy. Ethan forestalled the dilemma by lifting the weapon himself. Its balance had changed in his grip, less a tool now than a relic. When he placed it in the casing, a barely audible hum resonated through the box's lining. The advisor's eyes widened, but he said nothing, simply secured the lid with trembling fingers. Amid the lingering applause, someone called for a traditional human toast, awkward given the physiological barriers between the species regarding ethanol processing. A compromise appeared in the form of 2 glasses, one holding an Earth vintage already analyzed as safe for Zarathian consumption, the other filled with something from Lyra's homeworld that made the air above it shimmer faintly purple. They drank simultaneously. The wine tasted unremarkable. Any chemical transformation between species occurred at levels too subtle for human taste buds. The Zarathian cordial, however, made Ethan's entire nervous system briefly thrum like a plucked string. The sensation faded almost immediately, leaving behind a faint aftertaste like lightning and pressed flowers. Medical scans later confirmed no lasting effects beyond a temporary synchronization of certain brainwave patterns. Lyra watched him with an expression no translator needed to interpret. Through the dome above, sunlight gave way to stars as the station rotated toward its night cycle. The assembled delegates began moving toward adjoining halls where a feast awaited. Carefully vetted dishes from both cultures laid out on tables, designed to accommodate differing heights and limb configurations. Humans nodded politely to Zarathians they'd avoided eye contact with 6 months prior. Junior officers exchanged comm frequencies under the pretense of cultural education. Ethan caught one final glimpse of the relic box before attendants bore it away, already being called by another name in whispered conversations. Not the blade nor the weapon. The peace emblem. Lyra's fingers brushed his elbow, a human gesture she'd adopted without explanation. Behind them, a pair of science officers surreptitiously collected residual blood droplets from the chamber tiles. The samples would spend decades in laboratories, yielding papers and patents and 1 Nobel Prize before anyone admitted the truth. The most important reactions had already occurred beyond the reach of microscopes. The Odyssey's outer hull shimmered under projections of Earth's auroras colliding with Zerathian light songs, nebulae patterns entwined like fingers. Crew members watched the displays flicker across observation decks, the ship transformed into a floating canvas. No earthbound cathedral could have contained this ceremony. The vessel itself became their chapel, its corridors humming with preparations while docking bays housed delegates from 17 systems. Traditionalists from both factions arrived armored in skepticism. Human conservatives scowled at floral arrangements combining earth roses with Zerathian glow vines, their stems pulsing faint pink beneath careful grafting. Zerathian elders clicked mandibular plates disapprovingly when spotting human-style seating charts. The tension thickened until Lyra appeared at the central aisle's origin point. Her gown wasn't a dress so much as a living tapestry. Woven threads from Admiral Singh's ceremonial sash crossed ribbons repurposed from the Zerithos' battle standards. The bodice incorporated fragments of both ships' hull plating, microscopic shards polished into beadwork that caught light differently depending on the viewer's angle. A human designer might have called it ivory. A Zerathian would have named it Dawnfrost. Neither descriptor captured how the fabric seemed to breathe between color spectra. A hush followed her down the aisle. Even the most vocal critics fell silent when noticing the hem's intricate patterns, not embroidered but grown. Bioluminescent bacteria cultured from Lyra's own skin had been guided along specially treated threads, forming constellations recognizable to both species. The Great Bear flowed into Zerathia's flame nebula without seam or dissonance. Ethan waited beneath an archway where struts from both ships had been melted down and reforged. His uniform bore modifications few noticed at first glance. The high collar shortened to expose his throat in Zerathian tradition. The epaulets weighted with infinitesimal fragments of the hybrid alloy blade. When Lyra reached him, he inhaled sharply. Up close, the gown's bioluminescence reacted to his proximity. Cycling through hues the human eye struggled to categorize. They faced the ceremonial officiant, a frail-looking Zerathian, linguist who'd survived 3 wars and now trembled, visibly while holding the ancient text. Her voice rasped through the translator earpieces as she began the rites, alternating between languages every paragraph. Halfway through, she paused at a passage about shared burdens, then deliberately switched to Ethan's native tongue despite it not being in the script. The deviation made several elders shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then came the cups. 2 chalices floated on repulsor fields between the couple, one filled with Terran champagne, the other with Zerathian kirithol, individually harmless. Combined in any living system, they'd become a neurotoxin lethal to both species. The test wasn't ceremonial theater. 8 centuries prior, a Zerathian warlord had assassinated 3 rival houses this way during a wedding ceasefire. Lyra lifted the champagne without hesitation. Across from her, Ethan took the kirithol. Their eyes locked as the officiant recited the old warning about trust being the deadliest gamble. Their simultaneous swallows sent murmurs through the crowd. Medical teams stationed nearby activated body scanners, tracking the fluid's paths through digestive tracts. Seconds ticked by on displays, brighter than the ceremonial finery. The biology team would later isolate the mechanism, how enzymes in champagne's residual yeast bonded with kirithol's metallic compounds to form protective sheaths around cell membranes. At that moment, all anyone saw was Lyra's bioluminescence flaring gold-white, Ethan's pupils contracting to pinpricks, and neither collapsing. When the officiant declared them cleansed, the cheer that rose shook loose floral petals from their arrangements. Vows were exchanged without translators. Ethan spoke clipped military Zerathian, the accent atrocious but the grammar perfect. Lyra's English flowed with eerie precision, her vocal cords reshaping around syllables no anatomy text had prepared her for. Their promises weren't poetic. Neither mentioned destiny or eternity. Instead, they pledged to navigate each other's silences, to correct course when drifting toward unseen shoals, to share the weight of decisions that scar. As their hands entwined, the ship's AI registered an anomaly. Subsystems not programmed to interact began exchanging data, Zerathian biometric monitors feeding into human music generation algorithms. What emerged through the speakers wasn't a wedding march, but something unprecedented. Low hums mapping to Ethan's respiratory rhythms, layered with chiming tones derived from Lyra's neural frequencies. Delegates from both species swayed unconsciously, bodies recognizing the patterns before minds processed them. The kiss that sealed their vows lasted precisely as long as the musical convergence, 6.2 seconds, the time required for the AI to complete its impromptu composition. When they parted, the lights across the Odyssey's hull synchronized with the Zarathian fleet's exterior beacons, pulsing in a rhythm approximating their combined heart rates. Observers on nearby moons would report witnessing what appeared to be a new celestial phenomenon. Festivities blurred into receptions where human string quartets played alongside Zarathian wave harps. Children from both species darted between tables, stealing desserts their biology couldn't yet process but curiosity demanded they taste. Elder statesmen who'd once drafted war plans now debated whether Terran jazz could integrate with Zarathian resonance scales. Through it all, the newly bonded pair moved like planets in stable orbit, never more than 3 paces apart, fingers brushing occasionally as if verifying the other's continued existence. When exhaustion finally drove them toward private quarters, neither remarked on how the hallway lights brightened ahead of them and dimmed in their wake. The quarters had been prepared without consultation. Human furnishings mixed with Zarathian sleep slabs in an uneasy truce of aesthetics. Lyra laughed upon seeing the centerpiece, a bed somehow both too soft and too angular, clearly designed by committee. Her amusement faded when noticing the viewport's programmed display, Earth on one side, Zarathia's homeworld on the other, the images warping slightly where they met at the center. Ethan disabled the projection with a sharp gesture. What remained was pure starfield undiluted by symbolism. They stood together watching meteor trails streak past until Lyra touched the biosensitive clasp at her shoulder. The gown's bioluminescence pulsed once, fiercely, before dimming into something private. Across the room, the environmental controls interpreted the change and softened the lighting accordingly. Later, when sleep should have claimed them, Lyra traced the scar tissue along Ethan's ribs while he mapped the silvered lines across her back. No words passed between them, none were needed. The ship hummed gently around them, its systems calmer than engineering logs could explain. Far below in the medical bay, automated systems registered an anomaly in Lyra's latest biopsy scans. Microscopic cellular changes inconsistent with Zarathian biology. The ship's AI flagged it for morning review, before diverting power to sustain the hull's auroral displays. Outside, the joined fleets maintained formation, their running lights pulsing in slow unison like the world's slowest heartbeat. The first zygote of a new hybrid lineage divided silently in the dark, its genetic material already negotiating an unprecedented truce between evolutionary paths. Its parents wouldn't know for weeks by then. The child's cells would have resolved the most contentious debates about compatibility without consulting a single committee. The first child entered the world, screaming in 2 different octaves, sound no delivery room had ever recorded before. Medics later confirmed her vocal cords vibrated simultaneously at human and Zarathian frequencies. The real surprise came when they lifted her to the warming table. Her eyes, inheriting Lyra's elliptical pupils but Ethan's earth-toned irises, shifted from deep brown to emerald as her cries subsided into hiccups. Chart notes specified this wasn't a trick of the light. Pigment cells in her irises reconfigured based on emotional states neither species had mapped yet. 16 hours later, alarms blared through the neonatal unit. The infant stopped breathing mid-feed, her tiny chest utterly still beneath the monitoring strips. Medical teams rushed to intubate, debating whether to use human-sized tubes or the narrower Zarathian models. Lyra shouldered through the crowd before they could decide. She pressed her daughter's face against her own throat and hummed 3 notes in a scale human ears couldn't properly process. The baby gasped, then coughed, then drew breath through newly activated secondary lungs no scan had detected. Later analyses would show these organs had lain dormant until stimulated by specific harmonic frequencies. The nurses called it a miracle. The xenobiologist called it evolutionary pragmatism. Their first son arrived 2 years later, cord wrapped twice around his neck in a pattern resembling Zarathian prayer knots. He seemed fine at first, stronger than his sister, with Ethan's broad shoulders and Lyra's bioluminescent capillaries tracing his collarbones like liquid lace. The trouble started at 6 months when a well-meaning nanny offered him mashed bananas. Within 90 seconds, his markings flared scarlet and his primary lungs seized. Emergency teams from both species worked in shaky tandem, administering human epinephrine alongside Zarathian neural stabilizers until his breathing steadied. The allergy panel results made history. His immune system had flagged 7. Histories will call it the Vexus confluence, that moment when two civilizations teetered between war and something unnamed. Scholars will analyze treaties and trade agreements, debating whether economics or emotion forge the peace. The children know better. They inherit eyes that see beyond borders, hands that heal what scanners can't diagnose. In the archives, security footage still shows that first docking bay encounter. A helmet lifted. A commander's breath caught. The precise instant military protocols faltered against a more ancient language. The children paint galaxies on their classroom walls now. They mix colors no palette originally contained. Their brushes flicker between stars, connecting dots their parents once called enemies.